Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating systems in all of neuroscience, the visual system. And honestly, this system does so much more than just help us to see. When most people think about vision, they think about the eyes detecting light and sending images to the brain. But the visual system is far more complex than that. It helps us recognize objects, locate them in space, control eye movements, maintain visual stability when our head moves, orient toward important things in the environment, and even support posture and limb movement. So, this is not just a system for sight, it is a system for perception, attention, movement, and action. In this episode, we're going to walk through the major components of the visual system, including the visual pathway from the retina to the cortex, visual field organization, reflexes involving the pupil, the cranial nerves that move the eyes, the extraocular muscles, and the major types of eye movements. We'll also talk about common lesion patterns and what kinds of deficits they produce, because that is where the anatomy really starts to make sense. Remember, this is all from our textbook, Neuroscience Fundamentals for Rehabilitation by Lundy-Ekman. Okay, let's start at the beginning. How does visual information get from the eye to the brain? The visual pathway begins in the retina. The retina contains cells that convert light into neural signals. And those signals are processed within the retina itself and then passed along to the retinal output cells. From there, the axons of those output cells form the optic nerve, which you'll remember is cranial nerve 2. So, cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve, carries this visual information away from the retina now toward the brain. The right and left optic nerves travel toward each other and they meet at the optic chiasm. This is where the pathway gets especially important because some of these fibers cross the midline and some do not. After the optic chiasm, the fibers continue as the optic tracts. These optic tracts carry visual information to the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. And from there, the signals are relayed by the optic radiations now to the primary visual cortex. So if you zoom out, the conscious visual pathway can be thought of as a 2-neuron chain. First, from the retina through the optic nerve, optic chiasm, and optic tract to the lateral geniculate nucleus. And second, from the lateral geniculate nucleus through the optic radiations to the primary visual cortex. And that pathway is essential for conscious visual perception. But there's an important twist here. Not all optic tract fibers are headed to the cortex. Some collateral branches go to the midbrain, where they help control reflexes like pupillary constriction and reflexive eye and head orientation. So right away, we can see that vision is doing double duty. Some signals support conscious perception, while other signals support automatic responses. Now let's talk about how the visual world is mapped. A key concept here is the relationship between the nasal and temporal halves of the retina and the visual fields. The nasal half of each retina receives light from the temporal visual field, and the temporal half of each retina receives light from the nasal visual field. That can feel backwards at first, but remember that the optics of the eye reverse the image. At the optic chiasm, the axons from the nasal half of each retina cross the midline. The axons from the temporal half stay on the same side. That means information from the right visual field of both eyes ends up in the left visual cortex. Likewise, information from the left visual field of both eyes ends up in the right visual cortex. This is a major organizing principle of the visual system. Each visual hemifield is processed in the contralateral visual cortex. So if someone asked you, how is information from the right visual field conveyed to the left visual cortex? The answer is that the right visual field activates the left half of both retinas. Fibers from the right eye's nasal retina cross at the optic chiasm, while fibers from the left eye's temporal retina remain ipsilateral. Then together, they reach the left lateral geniculate nucleus and then the left visual cortex. That is one of those facts that shows up again and again in neuroanatomy. Now, once visual information reaches that primary visual cortex, the brain starts analyzing basic visual features such as shape, size, and texture. Then the information is passed to additional cortical areas for more advanced processing. There are two important streams that emerge from this cortical processing. First is the action stream, also called the dorsal stream, and this flows dorsally and is used to direct movement. You can think of this as the where or how stream. It helps you interact with objects in space. Second is the perception stream, also called the ventral stream. This flows ventrally and is used to recognize visual objects. You can think of this as the what stream. So if you see a coffee mug, one stream helps you recognize that it is a mug, while the other helps you reach for it accurately. And that's really a beautiful example of how the visual system is tightly linked to movement and function, not just perception. Now, not all visual information is routed to the cortex for conscious awareness. Some signals branch off to the midbrain. These collateral branches are crucial because they help produce reflexive control of the pupils and orientation of the eyes and the head. In other words, the visual system is constantly help us to react quickly and automatically to the world around us. And these midbrain connections are especially important when we talk about the pupillary light reflex. But before we get into reflexes, let's pause and look at what happens when different parts of the visual pathway are damaged. So a complete lesion of the optic nerve causes ipsilateral blindness. That means total loss of vision in the eye on the same side of the lesion. It also causes loss of the direct pupillary light reflex when light is shined into that eye, because the optic nerve is the afferent limb of the reflex. However, if light is shined into the opposite eye, both pupils can still constrict, assuming the rest of the pathway is intact. Another important clinical note is that the optic nerve is myelinated by oligodendroglia, not Schwann cells, which is why it can be affected in multiple sclerosis. Now let's talk about classic visual field deficits. If the retina or the optic nerve is completely damaged, vision is lost in the ipsilateral eye. A lesion in the center of the optic chiasm causes something called bitemporal hemianopia. And this means a loss of the temporal visual fields in both eyes. Why? It's because the crossing nasal retinal fibers are affected, and those fibers carry information from the temporal visual fields. A complete lesion posterior to the optic chiasm, such as in the optic tract, produces homonymous hemianopia. And this means a loss of the same visual field in both eyes, either the right or the left. The defect is contralateral to the lesion. Then there's cortical blindness, which occurs when a lesion in the brain eliminates conscious awareness of visual information. But there's also a fascinating phenomenon called blind sight. In blind sight, a person who is cortically blind can still orient to, point to, or detect movement of visual objects. And this depends on intact retina and preserved pathways to structures like the superior colliculus and the lateral geniculate nucleus. That's one of the wildest reminders in neuroscience that conscious perception and visually guided behavior are not always the same thing. Now let's move into cranial nerve 3, which is the oculomotor nerve. Cranial nerve 3 is important not only for extraocular movement, but also because it carries parasympathetic fibers to the intrinsic muscles of the eye. And these parasympathetic neurons begin in the parasympathetic nucleus of the oculomotor nerve in the midbrain. Their first synapse is in the ciliary ganglion, which is located behind the eyeball. Second order neurons then innervate the pupillary sphincter muscle and the ciliary muscle. The pupillary light reflex is elicited by shining a bright light into one eye. Light entering the eye causes constriction of the stimulated pupil, and this is called the direct response, as well as constriction of the opposite pupil, which is called the consensual response. And here's the pathway for that. So light stimulates the retina. The signal travels through the optic nerve to the pretectal nucleus in the midbrain. Interneurons connect the pretectal area to the parasympathetic nuclei of both oculomotor nerves. Then, parasympathetic fibers travel through cranial nerve 3 to the ciliary ganglion, and from there to the pupillary sphincter muscle. That's why one eye receiving bright light causes both pupils to constrict. Now let's add the near triad, which is what happens when we shift our focus to a near object. The near triad has 3 parts. The pupils constrict, the eyes converge, and the lens becomes more convex. That last part is called accommodation. And accommodation occurs because the ciliary muscle contracts, increasing the curvature of the lens so that light is refracted more strongly and remains focused on the retina. Unlike the pupillary light reflex, the accommodation reflex requires cortical involvement. So it depends on the activation of the visual cortex and the frontal eye field. So if the pupillary light reflex is a more automatic subcortical response, the near triad is more complex and uses cortical processing to help us focus on nearby targets. Now we'll shift from the intrinsic muscles of the eye to the extraocular muscles. So there are 6 extraocular muscles, and it consists of 4 rectus muscles and 2 oblique muscles. The rectus muscles are the superior rectus, inferior rectus, medial rectus, and lateral rectus. And the oblique muscles are the superior oblique and the inferior oblique. There is also the levator palpebrae superioris, which elevates the eyelid. And cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor nerve, innervates most of these. It controls the superior rectus, inferior rectus, medial rectus, inferior oblique, and levator palpebrae superioris. Cranial nerve 4, which is the trochlear nerve, innervates the superior oblique. And cranial nerve 6, the abducens nerve, innervates the lateral rectus. Now, a classic memory aid for this is LR6, SO4, all the rest are 3. In other words, lateral rectus is 6, superior oblique is 4, and everything else is 3. 6, 4, and 3 being cranial nerve 6, cranial nerve 4, and cranial nerve 3. LR6, SO4, all the rest are 3. Now for actions. So the lateral rectus abducts the eye, meaning it moves the eye laterally. And the medial rectus adducts the eye, moving it medially. The superior oblique is especially important because when the eye is adducted, it depresses the eye. The inferior oblique, when the eye is adducted, it elevates the eye. The oblique muscles attach to the posterior half of the eyeball, which is why their actions can be tricky to visualize at first. So how do both eyes stay coordinated? That's where the medial longitudinal fasciculus, or MLF, comes in. The MLF is a tract within the brainstem that connects the vestibular nuclei with the nuclei of cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6, and also links in head movement systems through accessory related pathways. Its job is to coordinate head and eye movements and help the eyes move together in a conjugate fashion. And this matters because accurate vision depends on alignment. If the 2 eyes are not coordinated, the visual system falls apart quickly. So let's talk here now about clinical deficits. A complete oculomotor nerve lesion causes severe ptosis because levator palpebrae superioris is weak here. The ipsilateral eye is positioned down and out because the lateral rectus and superior oblique are unopposed. The person then has diplopia, which is another word for double vision. They also have difficulty moving the eye medially, upward, and downward, loss of the direct pupillary light reflex, and loss of pupillary constriction when focusing on a near object. A trochlear nerve lesion prevents activation of the superior oblique. The ipsilateral eye then cannot look downward and inward effectively. And these patients often complain of double vision, trouble reading, difficulty descending the stairs because those activities require controlled downward gaze. The abducens nerve, if there's a lesion to that, we'll see that the eye deviates inward because the lateral rectus is weak and the medial rectus pulls now unopposed. The person cannot voluntarily abduct the eye and has diplopia. A lesion of the MLF causes internuclear ophthalmoplegia. This interrupts the connection from the abducens nucleus to the contralateral oculomotor nucleus. And as a result, when the person tries to look laterally, the eye ipsilateral to the lesion cannot adduct past midline, while the contralateral eye moves normally. Convergence may still be intact because convergence uses different neural connections. And that is a very high yield lesion pattern to know. So precise control of eye position is essential for vision. To see clearly, the image has to remain stable on the retina. And that means the nervous system must constantly stabilize gaze during head movement and redirect gaze efficiently toward things that matter. This is accomplished through the MLF, vestibulo-ocular reflexes, cerebral centers, and structures like the superior colliculus. The superior colliculus is especially important for reflexive orienting movements of the eyes and the head. So there are two major goals of the eye movement system: keeping the eyes stable during head movements and directing the gaze toward visual targets. For gaze stabilization during head movement, the nervous system uses the vestibulo-ocular reflex, or VOR, and optokinetic nystagmus. For shifting gaze to targets, the nervous system uses saccades, smooth pursuits, and vergence movements. So let's take these one at a time. The vestibulo-ocular reflex stabilizes visual images during head movement. It prevents the world from appearing to bounce around every time you move your head. The receptors for the VOR are in the semicircular canals of the inner ear, and these are three fluid-filled tubes in each ear. So when the head turns, activity changes in the vestibular nerves. Through brainstem circuits involving cranial nerves 3 and 6 and connections through the MLF, the eyes move in the opposite direction of the head turn. So if your head turns to the right, your eyes move left, helping you keep your gaze stable on a target. And this reflex is fast, automatic, and incredibly important for functional vision. The second major stabilization mechanism is optokinetic nystagmus. This helps adjust eye position during slow head movements or when large visual scenes move across the retina. It is elicited by moving visual stimuli, and it allows the eyes to follow large objects in the visual field. For example, if you are walking or looking out of a train window, optokinetic responses help your eyes to track the environment. Now let's talk about nystagmus, which is a rhythmic oscillation of the eyes. Physiologic nystagmus is normal, and it can be elicited in an intact nervous system by optokinetic stimulation, head rotation, temperature stimulation of the semicircular canals, or even by looking to an extreme horizontal position. Pathologic nystagmus, on the other hand, is a sign of nervous system abnormality. Importantly, the direction of nystagmus is named according to the direction of the saccadic or fast phase. Now for the voluntary and semi-voluntary ways that we direct our gaze, starting with saccades. Saccades are rapid eye movements that shift gaze quickly from one object to another. They can be voluntary, like when reading across a line of text, or reflexive, triggered by visual, auditory, tactile, or even painful stimuli. They're fast, efficient, and they're essential for scanning the environment. Next, we have smooth pursuits, and smooth pursuit eye movements are different from saccades. They are used to follow an object smoothly as it moves. For example, watching someone walk across a room or tracking a slowly moving finger. A moving visual stimulus is required for smooth pursuits. Then we have vergence movements, including convergence. These occur when the eyes move relative to one another to keep one image aligned on corresponding retinal areas, especially for near tasks like reading. During convergence, both eyes move toward the midline. It's worth noting the distinction between conjugate eye movements and vergence movements. Conjugate movements involve both eyes moving in the same direction together, while vergence movements involve the eyes moving in opposite directions relative to one another, such as both turning inward during convergence. Finally, let's touch base on a few terms related to misalignment here. Atropia is a deviation of one eye from forward gaze when both eyes are open. Aphoria is a latent deviation that becomes apparent when one eye is covered. A binocular fusion is the blending of the image from each eye into a single percept. When the systems that maintain alignment are disrupted, people may experience diplopia, suppression of input from one eye, and loss of depth perception. Lesions that interfere with eye movements can involve the cranial nerves controlling extraocular muscles, the neuromuscular junction, the MLF, the vestibular system, the cerebellum, or cortical eye fields. All right, so before we wrap up here, there's one more clinically relevant topic, and that's motion sickness. Motion sickness includes symptoms like nausea, headache, anxiety, and vomiting during movement in vehicles. It may result from a conflict between different types of sensory information or from postural instability. Seasickness, for example, may occur when visual and vestibular information do not match. And this mismatch can trigger a stress response and autonomic symptoms. It's a great example of how the visual and vestibular systems are constantly working together and how unpleasant it can be when they disagree. So let's bring this all together now. The visual system is not just about seeing, it's about perception, reflexes, orientation, eye movement, and action. Visual information begins in the retina, travels through cranial nerve 2, goes to the optic chiasm, then the optic tract, the lateral geniculate nucleus, and finally the optic radiations to reach the primary visual cortex. Information from one visual hemifield is processed in the contralateral visual cortex. Collateral pathways to the midbrain support the pupillary light reflexes and orienting responses. Cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6 control the extraocular muscles, while the medial longitudinal fasciculus helps coordinate eye and head movements. The vestibulo-ocular reflex and the optokinetic nystagmus stabilize gaze. Saccades, smooth pursuits, and vergence movements help to direct gaze. And when lesions disrupt these pathways, the resulting patterns of visual loss and eye movement dysfunction can tell us a lot about where the problem is. That's what makes the visual system such a powerful topic in neuro. It's honestly pretty elegant, it's highly organized, and it is deeply functional. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.